Hi everyone, welcome to the Europe Roundtable. Before we start, here are a couple of logistics remarks for this session. I'll try to save some minutes at the end of our discussion so that we can answer a question or two from the audience. So please post your questions on the chat moderated by Eric Epic from the Atlas team. Thank you, Eric. And another thing, please keep your microphones off at all times during our session. With that being said, let's get started. I believe I speak in the name of many libertarians, classic liberals, free market people, when I say that there is a lot of fog, bureaucratic and authoritarian fog coming in our way in Europe, reminding us of times we thought were only meant to be remembered as a history lesson to teach us and our governments not to make the same mistake that ended in economic crisis, wars, and having a wall built, the Berlin Wall, to separate the free Europe from the unfree. Nobody, even those of us experiencing first-hand dictatorships in the past, thought that a tiny virus will become the fatal excuse to be weaponized by some of our governments to massively erode our liberal democracies, to end the rule of law and dissolve civil liberties. So today I'm accompanied at this session of the Liberty Forum 2020 edition by Nils, Karlson and Stefan Kolev. We'll talk about how Europe fell behind in protecting our fundamental rights and civil liberties, and what it needs to be done to amend this road to serve them. Nils is president and CEO of the Racial Research Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. He's an economist and political scientist, professor in political science at Linköping University, and Stefan is a founding member of the Network for Constitutional Economics and Social Philosophy NOUS, based in Freiburg, Germany. He's a professor of political economy at the University of Applied Sciences in Zwickau, Germany. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Roxana.
So we have a state of emergencies and on and off, stepping on our liberal democracy. We have most European states applying terrible rules and policy reforms that prevent people from protecting themselves in the face of this healthcare crisis. And we have even European governments directly limiting and even taking away some of our basic civil liberties like the freedom of speech. And all this seems to be kind of ratified by the European Union, or in the best case, tolerated by our European MPs and bureaucrats. So Nils, let's dive in and talk a little bit about how did we get here?
Well, we got here from China, that's for sure. Communist dictatorship. And they implemented, in their given context, a lockdown, very severe lockdown. And in many countries, most countries in Europe, but in other parts of the world, copied this strategy. So we have research here at Roxana actually showing that people imitated each other. Countries followed each other in a very simplistic way. And I think the consequence of this, and both in the short run and the long run, is quite disastrous, actually. Stifling, private liberties, civil liberties, freedom movement. Has very severe consequences in the long run. And I think the key of it is actually that it affects the trust that people have in government, because government shown no trust in people. That's the dilemma here, I think, the key dilemma, that most countries did not at all trust their citizens to make judgmental good decisions for themselves. Instead, we had all kinds of lockdowns, we have state of emergencies in a very uncontrolled way. So it's going to be quite scary to see how this develops, actually.
So, exactly, instead of copying, let's say, those who trusted their citizens and this trust was repaid because people became aware and they sort of did what they had to do in order to save lives and also the economies. Our governments sold us the idea that it was either our life, either our economy, but we couldn't save both. We saw that in the case of some countries, that wasn't the case. So Stefan, for people like you and me, for instance, we already had to put up with dictatorships in the past. What would be your assessment on how can we reclaim as liberal causes, for instance, the rule of law that we've lost in Europe, the inequality, the respect for cultural diversity now turned into weapons to enforce authoritarianism in many of our countries? all across Europe.
So I fully agree, of course, that the challenges are huge. I would like to add that, well, let me say, I wouldn't be in the shoes of politicians right now. So that might perhaps be, or of policymakers in more general terms. I think it's easy for us liberals, libertarians to blame them for everything, but they're having a difficult time, just as we as well. And when it comes to Europe, and your question is specifically about different countries, I think we also need different responses to the challenges, how different countries are hit. So for example, the country I live in, Germany, I certainly see all kinds of constraints and limits, but they worry me much, much less than in my home country, Bulgaria. So since this is a panel on Europe, I do believe that we should differentiate between the different threats which hit different countries differently badly. So it's a challenge for everybody. It's a challenge for each society, but I think there are specificities which should not be underplayed. And indeed, we can learn from the past, but of course, it's something very different from what we had in communism. So as much as I love history, the question what precisely we can learn from history is a difficult one.
Can I answer this?
Yes, Nils, please.
You're making a very important point there, Stefan. It's basically a question of the status of the rule of law, the constitutional foundations of our different democracies in Europe. If you look at Hungary, for example, and Viktor Orban, he has given himself, supreme power about everything. He doesn't have to go to the parliament at all anymore. And he has extended this for another, I don't remember, but another 3 months or something, And that's extremely dangerous in the long run. That would not happen in Germany, would not happen in the UK, would not happen in Sweden. But some countries in Europe aren't that stable in terms of democracy.
Yep.
And we all know that populist governments are on the rise, I would say, in many countries. I think according to this Timbro Authoritarian Populist Index, which I would recommend to everyone who hasn't seen it, something like, almost 30% of the governments in Europe have a populist party in government. And another 4 governments are supported in parliament by populist parties, authoritarian populist parties, mostly on the right wing, some on the left wing. And that's the background we have to recognize when we see these lockdowns and these extreme measures that has been taken over the last 6 months or so. It's dangerous, really.
Yes, Stefan.
I think the main challenge or the main question is how the center of our political spectrum, which has suffered so badly over the past years, will go out of that crisis. So I do see a positive scenario where if we learn from each other and if we step by step find adequate responses which are more or less in line with civil liberties, that the center can be fortified and can regain some of the ground which it lost. But it's also possible, what Nils alluded to, that authoritarians and populists will gain traction. I think the winter which we are now entering is probably the decisive one, whether policymakers and the citizens in that division of labor in which we are with the policymakers will lose the sanity which some countries still have, or whether we will perhaps find some moderate responses to that super heavy challenge.
Yeah, Nils was mentioning the case of Hungary, and I would like to bring a little bit also the case of Spain, because the same measure that the extreme right populists implemented in Hungary are implemented by extreme left populists in Spain, having the government the whole power for the next 6 months, having declared a kind of state of alarm that they don't have to go to the parliament every 15 days to ratify whether it continues or not, and using the excuse, and this is not happening only in the southern Europe, to push more regulations in place. They say that it's for the COVID crisis, but we are seeing that they start controlling rent, they start pushing, for instance, increasing the minimum wage in a country which has already been very, very, I don't know, down by this crisis, this economic crisis. We have hiked the unemployment rate more than 40% for the young people and more than 20% for the rest of the population. So it's quite a very, very complicated scenario. So Nils, we've seen over the years that free market policies and regulation took poor people and turned them into middle class. Let's not forget that around 2/3 of the Europeans are probably middle class by now. Which are, in your opinion, the policies that should be overturned in 2021 in order to preserve and ideally to take more people out of poverty and into prosperity, taking into account that we have this pandemic issue?
Did you ask me?
Yes.
Now, let me come back to something else that Stefan just said. I think we need to be a bit humble here, and we shouldn't be alarmists. I think most governments are trying to handle this in a decent way, but they overreacted, and they may overreact again. And we shall argue that they shouldn't overreact. We have to keep our societies open. We have to keep our economies open. We have to protect the rule of law, civil liberties, political liberties, economic liberties, and so on. And I think we have a good chance of doing this. So this has really to be an exception, a short-term thing. And the risk is that it won't be, of course, you know. There are lots of research, you know, Robert Hicks and others, that crisis causes the Leviathan to grow. And we see that not only on how budget deficits, state expenditures and so on, taxes and so on are coming up now. We also see it on the European level, which scares me even more in a sense, you know. So the European Union, which I favor a lot, it's been promoting the rule of law, it's been promoting free markets, it's opened up Europe, you know, for free movement of goods, services, capital and people, you know. It's been fantastic, you know. But now it's turning into some kind of transfer union with they want to have their own taxes, and they don't talk about free competition anymore. They talk about fair competition, meaning not free competition. So we have to be very careful, I think, both on national level, but also on the European Union level, what's going on here. And I'm a bit more scared actually about the European level when it comes to countries like Sweden, Germany, Spain, Denmark, and so on and so forth, because our own democracies, I think, are fairly strong compared to Hungary, Bulgaria, and Poland, perhaps. I'm more optimistic about Poland. But the European Union doesn't have enough constitutional constraints, and the checks and balances are not there, you know. So that's quite problematic, actually. From a low level, it's coming up.
Yes, I would like to jump in here.
Yeah.
Because I fully agree that this is something genuinely new. So the crisis has been used and abused on the European level in a way which really has puzzled me, and which is opening now something which is scary. So we've had over all those decades, I think, basically two trajectories the European project could have gone. The one would be a large Switzerland, meaning open to foreign trade, open internally, but politically decentralized. Or a large France, which means more or less protectionist, okay, sort of open to the outside, internally integrated, but especially politically centralized. And I think what we experienced over the past months with the recovery fund, with that precedent that now the European Union itself can raise its own debt, is clearly yet another step towards this trajectory, or on this trajectory towards a large France. And this is really worrisome because I think it's not a slippery slope, we can come back, but that would be super, super difficult and would require coalitions, which I currently don't see. So I have to say, just as Nils, I'm a great fan of the European idea and of the European Union. But the recent months haven't made it easier to believe that the European Commission is, roughly speaking, on our side. So what they have done in the shadow of the crisis, basically using those exceptional moments in which we indeed are to do those things is problematic. And as always, I'm skeptical if those temporary issues will stay temporary, or as Nils said, will have some ratchet effects. And those things will actually add up over time to another European Union as compared to the one in which we were in February.
Nils, because of crises like this is the ideal scenario for governments, especially at the super level, like the European Union, and of course its managers and the bureaucrats, to expand their power. No? How can we fight back in the following months and years this tendency? Because we now have to think of a plan, of a short-term plan on how can we take steps towards a freer Europe, not an unfree Europe.
As always, there's no quick fix here. You know, it's happened quite suddenly. You know, this lack of support for liberal ideas, and it started before COVID-19. It's important to realize this. The rise of authoritarian populism, the restrictions on the rule of law, and well, increased belief in the state, you know, in industrial policies in many areas came before COVID-19. So there was fertile grounds for this, you know, and I think the first lesson is that we hadn't done our job. We thought we had won, you know. After 80s, 90s, early 10s, you know, deregulation, tax cuts and so on, free trade, opening up of everything. But then came nationalism and identity politics and all this. So basically, I think in the long run, we have to focus again on ideas, long run ideas, develop new ideas for these new challenges in this new kind of world. And I think it's a lot about providing a more attractive alternative to people, in the sense that apparently this kind of meaningful identities, national or group identities, we have to develop, I would say, liberal identities, which to me is more attractive, of course. But we haven't really done the job here. Also, we have to do the job concerning normative ethics, normative issues. For example, at least in Sweden, but many parts of the world, the question of inequality is like the big mantra, you know. And there are good reasons for liberals to develop their views on fairness and what you may call
common sense,
fair inequalities, equal opportunities, and so on and so forth. So I think in the long run, that's what we have to do. And in the short run, we have to criticize these policies, of course, because people don't really want to have their liberty restricted. They do it for short-term reasons. They accept it because, well, the COVID-19 is a very dangerous disease, but it has to be very short-time measures that has to be abandoned after, well, March or April, or whatever this is over. We will see, of course. So one have to, you know, I think have double strategies here, both very long-term strategies that we have to start work intensely on right now, but also act strategically in the short run. In a sense, being a bit pragmatic here in the short run, I think. Yeah.
Stefan, what's your thoughts on this issue?
So I do believe that we need a new neoliberalism, as I would like to call it. I'll say what I mean by that. And I also think we need a new vision of Europe. To start with the last one, I think liberals, libertarians, of all those varieties which we distinguish, haven't been very attentive over the past, let's say, well, my political memory goes back perhaps the last 20 years when it comes to Europe. I think we have been defensive at best, right? So we have tried to sort of roll back things which we don't like. But I'm not quite sure that we have communicated a vision of Europe. And with those small pictures which I depicted, large Switzerland as opposed to large France, that would be a vision which I think we really need to outline. We need to say practically what it means. And really to offer citizens, like the little politics I do on the streets of my town, is really to offer people a picture of where this wonderful project can go, and not just always be negative and say how terrible things are and that everything is going down the drain. Quite a few things are going down the drain, but if we show people a vision which they found realistic and we found attractive, I think we can get into a meaningful conversation. And regarding ideas, I also believe that that's what I meant with the new neoliberalism. I think the history of liberalism is a sequence of neoliberalisms in plural. So everybody in the history of liberalism whom we remember was a neoliberal as opposed to the generations before him. And that's why I think our time is quite specific, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of digitalization and many other challenges. And so we, as all those varieties of liberals, should not be happy to stick to the old dogmas and to read the books as though they were, Bibles which we just have to preach to the people. We should really be critical and say, what is the liberalism which our time needs? Many of the things which we find in those old books, my collection is full of old books, because that's what I do. Many of those books will still have insightful and illuminating things to say, but we need to be critical and to be innovative and say, well, does digitalization combined with globalization, combined with risks like the one which we experience, does it really bring challenges for which we need new answers? So I think a new European vision and a new neoliberalism will be the things most important for me, I would say.
Okay, so let's try and answer a couple of questions from the audience because we are running out of time. I mean, time passes so fast. What do you think about the civil rights and liberties in the countries at the edge of Europe, especially if one takes into account the war-torn Ukraine, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the contested elections in Georgia? Democratic decline in these countries, democracy, I believe, is declining in these countries, and it's indeed a great challenge. Should the EU take more active role in forcing countries to follow rules of law, fund cuts, limitation in EU positions, etc.? So let's answer this, and if we have time, we will answer another one.
Well, let the Eastern European perhaps in me reply to that. I think to the countries within, to countries belonging to the European Union, which are problematic, like Hungary or Poland, I think we should be extremely strict and should really impose what the European Union is about. Concerning neighboring countries like Armenia, Georgia, or Ukraine, I think we should, well, again, try to be an attractive project which those countries join voluntarily. We cannot impose on them anything. But if we, as a European Union, are attractive, if they decide not to remain a Eurasian country, roughly speaking, but really to join at some point that family of the European Union, they will basically, just as my or your country, Roxana, did it in the 2000s, they will approach the European values and the rules which go with those values. But again, within the European Union, I'm very much adamant that we must really impose a minimum regarding the rule of law, regarding the fight against corruption, cronyism, and things like that. In several Eastern European countries, including mine, Bulgaria, things are so terrible that I'm really ashamed to have that passport. So I think the European Union has an obligation to, again, not impose German standards, but impose minimum standards.
Exactly.
Otherwise.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I fully agree. Nils, do you have something to add to this question? And then we
very much like to make a few comments. The European Union have strict criteria called the Copenhagen criteria for countries that want to enter the Union. Mm-hmm. But they don't have strict criteria for countries who already have entered the European Union. So that's the challenge right now, and it's an acute challenge, I would say, when it comes to Poland, Hungary, and perhaps Bulgaria, Romania as well, and who knows, in the future, Italy or other countries. So that's really a key thing, you know. They have a veto, those countries, to stop all these reforms, and that's what Viktor Orban is trying right now. So this is a crucial moment, actually, for the future of Europe, right now. Also, I want to salute Stefan for his formulation of a new neoliberalism. I think that's exactly what we need. And part of that will be a more pluralistic Europe, you know. A pluralistic European Union would be a very good vision, I think.
We have another question. What will be the effect of all this in the legitimacy of the EU, especially in the first uncertain months? Each country went its own way. Will COVID be a further step towards delegitimizing the EU, or could a mega mobilization around the vaccine on a EU level turn this around? What's your thought about that, Nils? First, and then Stefan.
Well, I think the COVID-19 and the vaccine may be an opportunity for the EU. Maybe they can deliver something that's beneficial for everyone in Europe. But we will see if they will be able to do this. They failed in the early phases of this crisis, where we couldn't even, you know, import or export medical equipment and so on within the EU. People are skeptical towards EU in most countries, actually, and the EU themselves, the Commission and the Parliament, believes that, well, more transfers, more subsidies, more regulations from the EU level is the answer to this. And the social pillar, I think, is the best or the worst example of this. I think it will backfire. So I'm just like liberals, classical liberals look on all questions. The European Union should be small but strong when it comes to the rule of law and free trade. And I think perhaps also defense in the future. But apart from that, nation states should handle most things like healthcare and labor market issues and many other areas. Government should be small but strong.
Stefan, do you have some thoughts on that? Because we are almost out of time, so very short.
Let's take a final question, or should I reply for those 2 minutes? Okay, let me reply. So I think we can increase the legitimacy of the type of European Union, which again I try to outline with that large Switzerland. If we say that federalism is having a difficult time in the crisis, federalism, as we have it, as those laboratories of experimenting and learning, seems quite chaotic and so doesn't really make it easy for normal people to believe that that's a good thing. But if we convince people that precisely is learning with those many experiments which we have across Europe with different regimes handling the crisis, is precisely what got us faster of the crisis as opposed to unified states which had one solution only. That would be a way I would like to convince people that the European Union was precisely that, as Nils said, diverse space where we experimented, learned, and hopefully got out of that mess and probably of other messes as well because of that strength of diversity and federalism.
Okay, so let's keep this final idea from Stefan in mind. That's it. I hope we shed some light on Europe's course of action to safeguard free markets, therefore ensuring the continuation of free movement of goods, people, services, and capitals across European borders. And Liberty Forum 2020 is one of the, if not the best environment for all of us and our institutions to work on finding best ways and best practices to restore our fundamental freedoms swept away by the COVID-19 crisis, and prior to that, by the increased amount of red tape and government stirring of our lives and businesses. I know that many of us have worked since day one of this unfortunate new normal to take out the new and return to our societies to the normal. So make the most of it during these 2 days here at the Liberty Forum. And before we close our session, coming up next is the Legio Memorial Lecture by David Schmitz on the dangers of reducing moral philosophy to mere intuitions at the service of producing norms and laws. After that, at 2:45 p.m., we will have the pleasure of listening to our Atlas Network CEO, Brad Lips, on the closing remarks to boost out energy and confidence in our institutions. And at the end of this intense first day at the Liberty Forum 2020, just go and hang out with Magat Awad and other freedom champions at the Expo Hall. That's it, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.